I am a firm believer in the saying, everything happens for a reason. Being a part of such an instantaneous generation, I've come to realize that even in the most trying situations, no one takes the time to truly appreciate the outcome, including myself. Whether the outcome was positive or negative, I've realized that I've never even taken the time to consider what I can take away from the experience. To me, the outcome just simply meant something that marked an ending, and I'd be done with whatever I had to do or overcome. No more worries, no more nerves, over. Sure, the outcomes either bothered me or made me happy for a certain period of time, depending on the situation, but the thought of it all being over overshadowed every result, pushing all the hard work that I put into what I did completely out of the way. I've become accustomed to the idea that nothing lasts always, just deciding to brush it off since everything was done. But eventually, what always came back to me was the part where every experience taught you something beneficial for your future. Some things you'll just never forget.
I became all too familiar with this belief of mine when my pastor asked me to present a pre written speech during Black History Month in my church for one of our members. She had just taken a job at the White House during the Obama campaign, and he felt as if she should be honored. That's nice. He then went on to tell me how this was a surprise to both her and the congregation. No pressure. So my response to this question was a definite, of course. Not. Only 12 at the time, terrified to even think about speaking to any more than 3 people at a time, I was almost sure I wasn't the right fit for the job. No, I was completely sure. Especially out of all the other teenagers and adults attending my church who would have fit the description perfectly and willingly. Of course, my pastor wasn't even considering this answer, constantly mentioning something about how to help you in the future and how it'll help prepare you for high school, just the relevance of my thought process at the time. My mindset was somewhere far away from what he was trying to get me into. It was definitely somewhere far off into the distance, trying to find ways to get out of this. After 2 weeks worth of arm pulling and motivational words that mostly went in one ear and out the other, about a second later, I agreed to perform the speech. So, here I am, the last Sunday of Black History Month, getting ready to deliver a surprise speech to a well deserving recipient. And my morning couldn't have gone any worse. To begin with, of course, the entire family had to wake up late. Not because somebody forgot to set their alarm, but because unfortunately, the entire block had a power outage overnight due to a snowstorm, and the electricity hadn't returned until 8 a.m., leaving us only 3 hours before service started. Now that may seem like a long time, but 3 hours is never long enough in the Sherrod household. Of course, we have to go through outfit changes, hair, and the argument over whose car we're taking because one has more gas than the other. With such little time to get myself ready, then having to wait for the rest of the family to get ready, which consisted of my grandparents, my goal was to be in the car no later than 10 a.m. I was very punctual. That's when reality hit me. Ever since my grandparents retired, they've adopted the whole go with the flow motto, meaning we were finally on our way to church until 10:30. But you know what? Everything's okay. We're finally on our way to church. That's all that matters. The best days always started off bad, right? Finally, only 5 minutes away from the church, I see flashing red and blue lights, along with sirens. Great. So now we're all sitting and waiting patiently on the side of the road, embarrassed watching all the nosy church members hanging halfway out of their cars as they pass by to see what's going on. 10 minutes wasted on the cop doing all he has to do before he finally approaches the car. Then when the cop finally approaches the car and asks for registration and all that extra stuff, he then reveals the reason why he pulled us over. Apparently, My grandfather slowed down too early at a stoplight, which left me completely dumbfounded considering that we were only 20 feet away from the stoplight when it happened. Well, that's 20 minutes wasted. Once we were cleared to go, we finally found ourselves in the church parking lot. It is now 11 o'clock and church has started. Once we found our way inside of the church, I was asked to go into a meeting room to go over my speech with my pastor before I was presented. I was borderline exhausted at that point. From the events of that morning, and now that I was getting ready to present, my nerves were shot. As I was getting ready to go over my speech with my pastor, it was then that I realized I forgot my speech at home. I became extremely frustrated with myself. Everything was going perfectly wrong at that point. Luckily, my pastor was able to find an extra copy only 10 minutes before I had to present. So all I had was the practice I've had at home and the little time I had at the moment to look over the speech. But it was time to go. 10 minutes later, I found myself as the receiver of a standing ovation. Once I walked up to the podium, I suddenly had a burst of confidence and all my nerves seemed to disappear. After the audience quieted down, I then asked the recipient to come up and accept her award. She never came. Turns out she left church early to catch an emergency flight back to her hometown. For some reason, I wasn't even upset. I was too busy being proud of myself and appreciating the fact that this was all over. I was able to find something in myself my pastor saw all along, which was potential. I always hid in the background, instantly avoiding anything that had to be done in front of a crowd. I was so afraid of failing and not living up to his expectations, when all along, he chose me because of my expectations. I can honestly admit that although I was terrified, delivering that speech was one of my greatest accomplishments. That day had been filled with every trial and tribulation possible, but in the end, I'm thankful that I still went through with what was asked of me. I learned to fight until the end. About 2 years later, I was asked to come back and deliver a speech for the same event, but this time was different. I was actually ready. It was at that moment when I realized the first speech I had to recite happened for a reason. I was so focused on rushing to get through it that I didn't even pay attention to the fact that I did get through it. And very well at that. If it wasn't for that day, I still have the same mindset of that fearful little girl. After this day, I continue to look for and appreciate the outcomes of a situation. An outcome so small can follow you for years, all depending on the route chosen to develop from it.